right, it's 9 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started with today's workshop. Jason Ryan, welcome to the new faces in the room. This is our third workshop this week, so appreciate everybody staying with us. We've made some good progress both in the workshops, and then I know they've caused a lot of conversation outside of the workshop, so I appreciate all of the work that you all are continuing to do to help the task force move this topic forward on the timeline that we've laid out in our charter. So thank you all for doing that, and thanks for being here today. Today we're going to hear from some of the distribution providers. We've got 3 presentations, and good morning. What I'd like to do with today's presentations is move through all 3 of them, and then.
Yep, I got to get on a call. I think you're good. Buckholz is the next electrician if we strike out with Jenna.
If you're online, you can mute yourself. That would be great.
This is a valid platform. There's meetings, it's a correct platform.
Just a reminder, if you're on the Teams, if you could mute yourself if you're not recognized to ask a question yet. So like I was saying, we're going to have 3 presentations. I'd like to try to get through the presentations before we do a lot of Q&A, and then maybe the presenters can collectively answer some of the questions that are posed to them versus getting bogged down in the first one with a bunch of questions. But I also want to make sure that the task force members get to ask the questions that they need to ask when they need to ask them. So not a hard and fast rule, but just a suggestion on how we do today's session. I'll start out with the antitrust reminder. Section 4 of our charter states that the Commission strictly prohibits members of the task force and their employees and other entities or persons that may participate in task force activities from using their participation in task force activities as a forum for engaging in practices or communications that violate applicable antitrust laws. As a result, this task force today in this workshop and all of our work are committed to full compliance with federal and state antitrust laws and to maintaining the highest ethical standards in the way we conduct our activities. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I believe Encore will present first, then we'll hear from Bandera, and then we'll hear from AEP.
Where's the best place to be picked up by a microphone? Will it pick up from the front, or is it better if I just sit back here?
It'll pick up on any of the mics that are.
Martha, but you can come here if you want to. So come on in. I'll move over one, and then you can sit here and just hold the rest. Oh, yeah. All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Martha Henson from Encore, Director of Regulatory Affairs. I'm going to be joined by my partner in crime, Hagen Hench, who works in Fort Worth at our Distribution Operations Center. He's a director in our Operations Division. And so the way we divided this up with AEP and Bandera is that Encore would present kind of the current state of the distribution system. So it'll be a general overview of that system, some of the activities we perform relative to distribution. We tried to focus on, functions that we perform internally that may not be visible to external parties that you may not know about that we do for the distribution system. So we'll talk about the distribution operations centers, distribution automation and control, and outage processing for distribution outages. And then we close out the presentation with some thoughts around the distribution system that we thought the task force members may want to be thinking about as we move forward with the ADER pilot. One thing you'll notice throughout the slides is we tried to contrast the transmission system from the distribution system. Today, transmission voltage is how the vast majority of ancillary service providers and generators who offer in diskette are connected. That system is planned and coordinated closely between transmission providers and our friends at ERCOT. Distribution system's gonna be different, so really there, the utilities have the primary oversight role and control of distribution activities with pretty limited, oversight from ERCOT on that. So, next slide, please. Just a rundown of what I just mentioned about what we're gonna cover. And, next slide is just a quick overview of Encore. I think probably folks know who we are. We are the largest utility in Texas and serve about 35% of the ERCOT load. Relative to the ADER concept here, I'd point out that we have roughly 3,700 distribution feeders, distribution lines that serve customers and other businesses with more than 3.8 million metering points. And we're the regulated piece of the industry here in Texas. I also wanted to mention, there's lots of different flavors here. So you have the investor-owned utilities like and then you have municipally owned utilities, like, for example, CPS is one of the ADR task force members that operates a municipal utility, and co-ops. So, for example, LCRA and Bandera, who's a task force member in the co-op space. You also have a different cut between transmission and distribution. So there are some utilities that are transmission-only providers in ERCOT. There's others that are distribution-only, and then you'll have companies like Encore that actually own and operate both transmission and distribution. The one thing we do have in common, I would say, if you go to the next slide, is how we think about the difference between transmission and distribution. So transmission voltage in ERCOT is primarily going to be 69 kV, 138, and 345. And then distribution voltage is typically sub 60 kV here in ERCOT. When you think about the transmission system as compared to distribution, and I would say the transmission system is, it's a networked system with redundancies, redundant paths built in. So think of it like a highway system. It's highly networked. The distribution system, in contrast, I would say is more like your neighborhood streets or cul-de-sacs. So the distribution system it's mostly a radial system that has power flow only going in one direction. And then in the middle, you have substations that connect the two. So the substations are the facilities that transfer and transform the high voltage transmission system energy down to distribution voltage. And then the roads coming out of the substation are your distribution lines. So you'll hear probably the utilities refer to those as feeders a lot. It's feeding service to customers and businesses. So that's kind of the common term that we use when we talk about distribution lines. One thing of interest you may not have actually been aware of for Encore, if you look at it just on a pure linear mileage basis, the vast majority of our system is actually distribution voltage. So we have over 120,000 linear miles of distribution facilities that we own and operate. While the transmission is a much higher voltage, there's actually fewer facilities on a per mileage basis. So the next piece here, we're going to start transitioning into some of the differences in real-time information that we have for transmission versus distribution, and then into our distribution operations centers. So I'm going to turn it over to Hagen for this piece.
Okay, so I'm standing here,
Yeah.
so you can pick it up. Okay. So in order to add the operational perspective, and I want to point out a little bit the differences between transmission and distribution again, and give especially those in the audience that are not familiar with the distribution operations a flavor for what it looks like to operate a distribution system. So in my attempt to explain that, I'm trying to use basic terms and not get too technical, and there's too many acronyms here, but if I over-trivialize, then I want to apologize to those of you that are more familiar with the distribution system. So the first perspective to take would be to take what real-time awareness do we have, transmission versus distribution. There are some very distinct differences there. On the transmission side, as it relates to generation, we have visibility. The generators and the transmission providers are working closely together. They have awareness of each other's statuses of production, of what lines are in service, how the power flow at that bulk system, at that network backbone, if you will, of the overall electric system. There's close cooperation between the transmission providers, the generators, and ERCOT to keep that bulk system up. At the distribution level, we have literally no insights whatsoever. We all sometimes have the web page up with the ERCOT dial, but other than that, there is no SCADA or there is no operating interaction with anybody that generates. So we qualify that as the distribution level. Operations has zero awareness of the generation status at the distribution level. If we go over and look at, well, what about the facility information? How do we know what lines, what devices that make up our electric grid are up and running and doing their job? At the transmission level, we have largely almost full SCADA availability of those facilities. We see exactly what's going on. We are monitoring how all this equipment is performing against the set parameters, the operating parameters. On the distribution level, it's a little bit different. We do have SCADA at distribution, but the SCADA as of today, and there's a transformation taking place. We're gaining more and more visibility at the distribution level too. But today, most of the visibility is in the substation. That's that connecting point between the bulk transmission level, and then you're going down into these radial feeder lines. So SCADA is present in most of the substations, so we see if these feeders are energized or not. But then in many facilities, it gets dark. These feeders are historically at least very dark lines, they're radial lines, and historically in the past at least, we wouldn't even know if there's an outage unless customers call us. So there is limited visibility of that. It is increasing as distribution utilities invest in SCADA equipment, automation. And I may also want to make a point on the AMS system, the automated metering system. It provides us new insight and visibility on the very far edge of the customer list on that meter. But it is not like SCADA. It is not a real-time control or monitoring system. While we are getting interval data every 15 minutes in terms of consumption and maybe some operational parameters like average voltage and things like that, all that data is collected at a meter, but not downloaded into the back office database at the utility until hours after it's measured. So, depending on the setup for each utility, in our case, we may have a download once a day, but not every 15 minutes.
Why are there differences in sort of well, what's driving how often or when you get to see that data?
Well, a lot of it is driven really by the setup and by the limitation of the communication infrastructure. If you just can imagine, there are 3.8 million meters at on-port system. Setting it up as a real-time SCADA system would be very demanding on the communication infrastructure, very costly. And so when the meter system was rolled out, it was clearly done with the purpose of collecting meter information, maybe some limited operational insights to help us with that, but it was never intended to be a real-time SCADA system.
Is there battery stopping relay or something? If so, at what level from the feeder, if there is generation coming back, is there relays that will trip, or if so, at what level?
No, well, and I'll let Michael maybe explain or here.
It depends on the situation,
Yeah.
And the relay setup for the individual substations. In instances, there are directional relays that are meant to keep a fault on an adjacent feeder or feeding into the transmission system from occurring. It does not necessarily prevent backfeed through a device, but it depends upon the device, dimensions of the device, the relay capabilities, all of those things. Some devices just aren't capable of
So
doing it.
it's mostly at the substation level, so if the feeder load and the back generation cancels out, then potentially there is no problem also with that.
It depends on the device at the individual levels, whether it's a device on the distribution system itself, a device such as the feeder breaker, or some device inside the substation, such as transformer protection or anything else. The capabilities and the settings of that device determine what actions occur upon different events on the grid, such as vacuum.
And settings will be changed to allow it?
Sometimes it is a matter of changing settings. Sometimes it is replacement of a device with another device that has the capability that you need to facilitate
also a point when I'm going to that third column here, what is the awareness on our abnormal conditions? And I think there's a big difference if you think of transmission. There's a very planned, very structured process, how you apply for clearances, how you apply for outages if you take a line out. And a lot of it is built on the assumption and understanding that there's a large redundancy in that networked backbone system, if you will. In distribution, where you have radial lines, it is a very different situation. So when you have abnormal conditions or you take something out for construction, you would actually cause an outage. That is not a networked type setup, and it's not very stable, if you will. So what you have to do is we have to isolate that area, limit that clearance to where it doesn't affect customers, and then reroute that power through closing a switch from a neighboring facility to bring that in. So when we say radial, it doesn't mean that there are no connecting points between the feeders. They are, but they're typically in a normally open position, and they only come into play when you actually have an abnormal condition to reconfigure your feeder setup. I'm saying this because of the vast number of devices and feeders on the distribution system. There is a very, very large number of possible configurations. So how you're splitting up your lines, how you're reconfiguring them. So when it comes to, measuring points and operational set points for relays, that is, your fault current constantly changes as you're reconfiguring all your distribution facilities. So you may have a totally different situation one week over the next week based on what activity is going on these distribution facilities. And I'll point that out later a little bit in terms of what amount and what number of activities we're experiencing on our distribution system.
Maybe you're covering it. How do you manage outages in real time?
Yes. I have a little process how we go through an outage process.
And will you cover, maybe any speaker can cover this 2 minutes on kind of what is the experience during URI for the distribution system, right? So when megawatts aren't coming, what are you doing? And that's an important question for me because I'm thinking from the CPP perspective, like, okay, what could DERs be doing when you're not getting megawatts in that direction?
Yeah.
Obviously, in small quantities, that's huge, but that's what we're trying to understand is what's the long-term play for reliability in the other direction.
Remind me of that, just to make sure I cover it, because I don't have it on the slide, but I can explain to you how we handle that.
We have it on the slide.
Yeah. Okay. Then let's go to the next slide. So we'll actually go back one more, just to make sure. So what I try to point out here is that on the distribution level, typically there is no communication to the customers, there is no notification, there is no planning. It is all very reactive. Literally, the construction crew shows up in the morning, needs a clearance, and we'll take that out, and we're reconfiguring, and that's going on every day. So we have about 15,000 of them in a calendar year where we're taking clearances, abnormal switching, just on the main line. So that's very active, and I'll point that out later with some statistics. So it's very situational, circumstantial, very reactive in that sense, very different from what those that are familiar with the transmission system to be aware of it. Lots of people constantly working and tinkering with our distribution system every day. Okay, next slide. If you look at the control rooms, based on what we just discussed here, you can see how the control rooms and the activity in the control room is a little bit different between transmission and distribution. In transmission, the controllers sit watching the monitors, they're watching the overall system and grid, and largely focus on making sure that the system is operating within the set parameters, that everything is in the operating boundaries. They're facilitating also outages and switching orders. There's maybe maintenance or new construction going on in the transmission line. But it's all very anticipated, it is all very planned, and it is all very stable. So there is not it shouldn't be a stressful feel. It's very organized, it's very similar to ERCOT in that sense. On the distribution side, on the other side, just think distribution control center sometimes feels more like a call center. Lots of phone calls, lots of activity going, lots of reactive response. I have outages, I have construction, a car hit a pole. a telephone provider wants to set an antenna on top of a pole, and everybody wants to get and make sure they're working safe out there. Some people, their controller may have 10 phone calls on the queue while he's picking up a radio and a phone, and so it's a very kind of a hustle and bustle type of environment. It can go up, it peaks very steep, there's a lot of activity, and then it may drop down, it's very quiet again, and then the next hour it peaks back up. So it's a very dynamic, very volatile environment, and the way we are set up is to constantly adjust even staffing in the control center. So we can expand our desks, we can contract them to respond to this volume of work that is going on. And I have that later on, but I shared with you here. Just think of it, there's 3.8 million customers on Encore system. We have, 122,000 miles, 1 million devices that are managed out of these two distribution operations centers. And in each center, based on the shift, we may have between 6 and 12 people managing that entire grid for the distribution level. So it's a large scale, very active, very busy system. We go to the next slide. I want to describe that distribution system with a little bit different terms. You heard the miles, you heard the difference, how it connects to the transmission system. So we're talking about 122,000 miles of line, so that it is largely a mix of rural and urban areas. So Encore system is kind of a combination. On one side, we have the DFW area that feels a little bit more like Centerpoint, Houston, and then on the other side, very rural, very far feeders in rural areas that are more like a co-op, a rural co-op. This, our longest rural feeder may be about 50 miles long, versus in the Metroplex, it may only be half a mile. So there's lots of customers, so very diverse. And Encore has about 1 million active devices on there. Active devices is not the poles and the conductor, those are the devices that do something. So like transformers, capacitors, switches. So just think, those 6 to 12 people monitoring a system with 1 million devices that are acting and doing something. What I want to point out, on a distribution system, you have about 80, on Encore system, we have about 80,000 switchable devices. So those have the capability to reroute the power flow. But here's the point, that's where we are in that transformation, in that transition. Historically, 20 years ago, I would say, all of those 80,000 probably didn't have any SCADA. They were totally dark, nothing. Somebody has to go out there and manually operate that switch, either with a stick and operating up on the pole or through a crank handle at the bottom. That's literally how we operate these devices. And today, about 11% of those 80,000 at Encore are SCADA enabled. So we still have a large portion of that distribution system, and it requires major investments if we ever wanted to go to a point where it's 100% SCADA enabled. Currently, we are already monitoring about 420,000 SCADA points on the distribution system associated with that 11 points. That is almost double of what we are monitoring in the entire transmission system, just from a scale perspective, what these systems and these people in the control center have to operate with. We have a mix of urban and rural. So here's kind of, the setup at the control center. If you translate that setup, these 122,000 miles with all these devices and that activity into activity, so what work does it result in the operating center? So think of it, we had at Encore about last year, 2021, 500,000 outage and emergency tickets. That's like your IT help desk ticket. Something is happening out there. I have a ticket. You need to respond with somebody to go out there and check. Those are not just outages. This could be emergency tickets where the police arrive and there's a low wire or something. So not all of them are outages, but those are tickets. Those are not customer outages. So the way that works, and I explained that in that outage process again, that one device, a fuse, may open up and blow, and it affects 100 customers. So I have 100 outages, but only one ticket that is at that fuse, right? So just to see that difference. We are supporting, out of our two control centers, 40,000 construction projects per calendar year. So just a lot of them are overlapping. So each day, I have on average about 3,500 FTEs doing something somewhere on those 120,000 miles. It's a very, again, I think I mentioned it, very busy time we live in. to accommodate abnormal conditions, switching, reconfigurations, new facilities being placed in service. We are facilitating 15,000 load switching operations on that. Each of them has multiple steps of switching. It's a switching order in our world, what we call it. So there's 15,000 of them. That's a big part of our daily activity, and connecting about 80,000 new premises or meters to this Encore distribution system. We're building entire new cities every calendar year on that thing. So it requires new construction, capacity expansion due to load growth, due to new premises. So, and again, it's not a network grid. It's these radio lines that require reconfiguration to avoid or minimize any outages associated with that activity. The metering system is very helpful to us. We have about 10 million operational pings. Those are pings that we initiate at the control center to verify is that customer on or off or gain some kind of operational insights from it. The ping is the only real-time thing we can get from the meter. And I said earlier, all the data gets uploaded once a day. That's true for all the measurements, but I have the ability to ping a meter and see if it's on or off. If it's on, it's pretty reliable. If it's off, it doesn't mean the power is off. I may just not have communication, right? There could be multiple things, but in general, the ping is kind of the only real-time little touch point that we have to those meters. Yes, sir.
When you have a rep change at a premise level, is that included in that 80K premise disconnect, reconnect? Or?
No, it's not. That is literally physically setting a new metering point, setting a new premise up in the distribution system.
So what do you have to do? What does the control room or what does the distribution company have to do when a customer changes the rep?
Nothing. So we do not handle anything in the control room. That is really just a setup in the customer information system. It's an accounting change, if you will, and then a metering operation where you interact with the meter potentially if you wanted to connect or disconnect temporarily or whatever the proper service process is associated with that.
So is there a physical connect and disconnect?
We can operate that inside the meter remotely.
Remotely?
Yeah, that wouldn't be. Some meters will require a physical visit, so it's not 100%, but most of the meters we can remotely connect or disconnect.
So when a customer changes his rep, there is a physical disconnection and a reconnection?
No, because they're keeping it, right? They're keeping it running.
There's no physical disconnection. It's a transaction that's processed through ERCOT.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think
There
one
was
point,
reassignment of the ECID to new accounts. They receive that information and they continue to
No, I just heard that sometimes there is a physical disconnect and a reconnect, even though that
We do disconnect for one day, but I'm not for a switch. Not for a switch. Yeah.
oh, I was just gonna say, I think, part of the clear, like, what happens on the SCADA side is completely isolated from everything that happens on the individual meters, right? The individual meters, it's basically on the open internet, which is kind of one of the big risk factors we have around meters. So you can think of the meters as just a simple customer-facing transaction, while on the SCADA side, that's all secure, it's highly risk-proof, it's one of the things we evaluate on a day-to-day basis in terms of vulnerability to our utility systems. On the meter side, still a high level of risk, but we don't manage it in the same way. So completely isolated, I almost hate to have them on the same page at the same time because they're just different worlds.
Yeah, I mean, they're separate systems, that is true. However, it's very useful and has really made a big difference in how we're operating our distribution system today. So there's very separate, very different, but both have a big role in our operations these days.
So if a feeder has a critical load, is it theoretically possible that the feeder be kept alive, but all the other non-critical loads be switched off from the meter?
No, we do not operate like this. The meter communication, again, is not a real-time operation, and there's a lot of issues associated with, like, what meter has what capabilities, so we don't operate and differentiate different meter types or different premise types, and then we are utilizing our SCADA equipment to do what you're describing. So we have SCADA switches on the line where we can sectionalize, isolate different parts of the feeder. So we operate that way, but it is all on SCADA. None of the meter system is involved in any switching or isolation type of activity.
But you pull on an important thread, and Arushi, this touches on your point about Winter Storm Uri. Immediately following Winter Storm Uri, we were approached both by ERCOT as well as other entities around using the AMI meter system to isolate parts of the grid. So instead of doing these massive rolling blackouts, which is like using like a bomb to
Surgical strike.
exactly. Using AMI meters, you can be very precise. And we have some non-disconnect customers, like customers who have medical issues, you know, they absolutely have to have power that we weren't able to take care of in a way, maybe this is broadly across the state, like we wanted to because we didn't have that precision. So to your point, we are looking at ways of utilizing AMI meters to do the job, but ultimately, when ERCOT sends the signals to start doing load shed, it's a SCADA function at this point, and as to my knowledge, across the state, that has not changed.
And I would just add, our meters are not actually capable of doing load shed at the meter level right now without significant investment. But that is not a possibility.
Isn't switching off the same, like you disconnecting the meter to provide the power, just like that? Wouldn't it be the same, like not giving them power? No?
It is, it's just the way it's handled, right? That's onesies and twosies.
That's right.
We can turn off at max somewhere around, like 1,200 meters a day before we overwhelm the system.
Even if we have sometimes, you know, you have a hostage situation from the police, and you don't want to drop a whole feeder or a large section, you want to be very granular, we would go out and maybe pull a fuse to get 100 customers, you know, that would affect that facility or the transformer. So we're trying to minimize the effect, but we wouldn't do it at the meter level. It's all onesie, twosie. It would be very slow, very gone. The systems are not set up for that. You know, just think 3.8 million, and where do you find them? Where is even your association with the devices, your connectivity, what meter belongs, all of that would have to come into play. So it's not as trivial as it may sound on a sheet of paper.
Well, and just adding, not all meters are capable of disconnection. I mean, residential, that is the capability of them, but instrument rated meters or anything else, which are your larger load customers, are not capable of it just because that is not in series to create that disconnection. So there is a large portion of the load that is not, just physically not capable of it, no matter, you know, to perform those actions.
So, what I want to add in that last section here is, obviously, the distribution system for all of the distribution utilities is a system in transition. So we often still think about, 80,000 switches, or 90% of them still not being SCADA enabled and manually operated on those radio lines. However, more and more technology and sophistication, data-driven things are coming online. So as we deploy more SCADA-enabled switches on the distribution lines, several of those, in our case, 2,500 are peer-to-peer automated switches. So they operate as a team. They're taking measurements, condition measurements on the line, and then isolate an outage that may occur or a fault that occurs automatically, and reroute the power on those distribution lines through a peer-to-peer communication without any interference or injection by the control room operator. So we have about 2,500 of them. They are also, which is important to know, because they're also integrated with the substation, because you don't want to create a backfeed situation where you're connecting two feeders together to restore power to a section of a neighboring feeder, but then really you wanted to turn that feeder off at the substation by opening that breaker and not getting the backfeed from those automated switches. So there's coordination between these switches and how the logical setup is configured and under what operating conditions, what fault current they can handle, all those kind of things. So it becomes more complex to operate. I think that's kind of the main point I'm trying to make with that. In the same way, AMS and ADMS is the Advanced Distribution Management System. To differentiate that from the old style distribution management system, there's an integration. The meters are automatically informing the decision in the ADMS system in terms of what switching action should be taken, what outage status we're seeing on the customers. So it becomes more complex and more integrated, all these different systems. And trouble analysis is, just for those that are not familiar with it, when we have an outage that a customer or a meter calls in, like a meter reports I'm out, or a customer calls to the call center and saying, hey, I have an outage, we are not looking at the individual outages per se in the control in the operating center. We are looking at the roll-up. So based on the pattern of those calls that are coming in, the software automatically interprets these calls and decides, oh, this transformer is most likely the one that is out, or this recloser is the one, or this fuse is the one that is open to protect the system, and this the source for the outage. So when we dispatch, when we respond, we always respond to devices. We don't go to the customer. We're going to where the device is located that is most likely, to cause that power interruption. So that those devices may be miles away from where the customer lives that has called the outage, right? So these kind of algorithms, these kind of integrations exist in our distribution system. There's some acronyms here: block, fault, location, automatically locating faults based on the measurements or some of the information we get back. Same as the automated, not just fault location, but also the isolation and switching around it, that the software is automatically suggesting how to respond to a power interruption. Those are all integrations that exist in modern distribution management systems. And the last point is actually that one of the challenges we have when it comes to software and how we operate a distribution system, because of the scale and all that activity, our main goal is how to suppress and filter information, right? So we have information overload, so it's just too much going on all at the same time, and we really need to focus on those information items that are actionable, where we need to take action right now, and so a lot of effort is spent on to providing new user interfaces, how to condition that information to where the operator in the control room can take action on, rather than just FYI dashboards. There is not enough time and not enough people that can just watch stuff. With that, I'll walk you through an outage process very quick, just to give you a general feel for that. So outages come in through multiple channels. Most of the outages today come through the AMS meters. So, right, the vast majority, there are some customers that are faster than the meter and calling them in, but generally you would expect the meter is reporting up, I'm out, the last gasp, what we call it. The meter is providing that message. Customers calling through text, web, phone calls, all these different channels that we now offer. You have some.
Yeah, I was just curious. What is the communication infrastructure between the AMS and Encore?
Well, it's a variety. As you might imagine, it would be a lot easier for us if it was one big city. But the rural areas, so we are using a variety of communication technologies and infrastructure to, if you're in the far out West Texas, Andrews County, there's different challenges than when you're in the middle in downtown Dallas. And so for the most part, it's wireless, it's mesh, we may have some backbone fiber infrastructure. We used to have even some power line still in there. So it's a mix of things to reach those meters, depending on the geography and the conditions in that area.
Okay. And is there some sort of thing where if you're down a feeder in a rural area, the messages kind of go back and forth from meter to meter?
Yeah, that's
not just broadcast.
They use each other to find the most vital path back for the packets, okay. And then they have routers and collectors where the information gets bundled up, and then eventually through the.
So it's not a broadcast, and you can't pull individual meters.
We can ping individual meters even as a batch, so I can batch ping like thousands of meters, but it's just a ping. It's just like, oop, I'm alive, or okay. I don't get anything.
But if you want to get data back, the meter read.
It's like
If you want to get volumes of data like the meter read. So that is like meter to meter to meter, it just keeps on coming back?
You can request a download, an ad hoc request and it's meter download if you want to, but it's, time consuming and it's manual, but there's not a.
Manual?
Yeah. You can like.
Okay, you can manually make the request.
Yeah.
And then how would that data come back? Is it kind of hopping from meter to meter to come back?
Yeah.
Okay.
So on the outage side, so here's the outage channels, the back end center on the IT or the call center basically takes that information and writes literally a ticket or an event description into our outage management system. So the outage management system, now we call it ADMS, the Advanced Distribution Management System, that's the software that the operator in the control room uses. And so that's where that ticket gets created, with all the information that was collected in the call center or what we know about that. And then you have that automatic roll-up, right, where these outage calls get bundled up to the device level with the predictive state. It's that transformer, it's this fuse, whatever is the source for that outage. And that's what the operator is looking at. At that point, we're generating an automated, an estimated time of restoration. The customer gets notified, outage was reported that affects your home. Here's the estimated time of restoration, and then we'll keep the customer updated on the progress of that. The operator is looking at that ticket and analyzing first on the software, what's going on, what else does he see? Maybe a 911 call came in, the police, so that anything additional from the situational awareness that would inform them how to respond to that outage. Yes, sir.
So, that when something also occurs in between the line, for example, the tree falls or whatever. So my understanding is that advanced meter keeps sending the data to the nearest meter, your office location, right? So that meter, advanced meter, keeps sending like every 15 minutes or so, right?
No, that is not true. We are measuring every 15 minutes what the consumption is and maybe some other measuring points. That gets stored locally inside the meter in a register. And then once a day, we are downloading that information into the data center at Encore.
So that meter not keep sending this data outage location or whatever, not sending to the meter?
No. So you have, we call it, it's a big capacitor in there, in the meter. And when the meter is losing power, if the outage occurs, the tree hits the line, lights go dark, the last thing the meter does is it uses the energy in that capacitor to send that last, I'm out. Done. Then you will not communicate with that meter anymore, period. Until the power comes back on, that is dark.
So what is the purpose of that advanced meter then?
What is?
So what does the advanced meter is different from the normal meter?
It's that we don't have to go out there and read it manually by looking at it.
That's it?
That's the original. There's lots of other advantages, of course.
And you have the 15-minute.
Yeah, well, you can get, there's a lot of advanced capabilities in meters, and it depends on the meter itself. There's other readings that you get outside of just the kWh and things like that you get on the normal mechanical meters. You can get things like average voltage, inflow and outflow in a directional channel, not a net value, but an actual inflow and outflow. You get time-stamped values of some of those things, or time series data that you can use to see when the inflow and outflow is occurring or anything like that.
Even historical data and having the interval data, having these measuring points, open up a whole new area of where you can do predictive analytics around your equipment performance, when your transformer fails or are overloaded. We even, have a very high-level load flow estimator on the distribution system that uses old load information, the load profile per meter, and it can estimate how much load flow currently is on the lines based on what happened, 12 or 24 hours ago. So you have more accurate understanding, but again, it's not anything near what we have as a true SCADA system. So it's much better, has a lot of operational advantages, but it's not to the same degree as a SCADA system.
I see. I was thinking that meter keeps sending the data to the nearest office location, so the folks from there, they can come to the place and they fix the line or something.
Yeah.
That was what I was thinking.
Well, that's partially correct, right? So when you get that last signal from the AMI meter, that gives you a geographical idea of where the outage might be. So you can say it's going to be in between this junction and this junction because all of these, it's basically flat because all the meters.
I agree with with the gentleman here, actually, it's even more than that. We have a specific, if I have 5 meters or 10 meters in a geographic area, I know I can pinpoint the device that is associated with these meters, and I know that the outage now is due to a fuse being blown or a transformer fuse being open, anything like this. So I have a very good understanding where I need to go.
Yeah, so one clarification, so the system protection is meant to clear, right, a fault. So in the case of a tree hitting a line, there's a protective equipment that's upstream, not necessarily where the tree hit the line, but upstream that's going to detect, right, a hard fault. And it'll open, and so that de-energizes the line, right? That system protection is what clears, right, the immediate danger, right, of having the line energized. Now, and so it's important to understand, right, the fact that even though you have a cluster of meters that are out, it all hinges upon the line exposure that you have from the protective device to where the load is, right? And so the responders will go starting from that protective device and then patrol the line to make sure, figure out what happened.
Right. And in fact, that's what I'm explaining here. Actually, what we do first, as the operations guy here, is we first don't even patrol the line. We are first trying to isolate the exposure of that line. So there's a protective device upstream the line that is opening up whatever it is. Let's just assume it's the breaker at the feeder in the substation. The large fault, the hard fault, the breaker opens up. The first thing the operator will do is he is looking at this, where could the location be? Did I get a 911 call? So how can I maybe dissect that feeder in half to see if the fault is, downstream or upstream from the midpoint of the feeder? And the first thing I do is I'm trying to isolate that fault. Where is it going on? By operating switches. So if I have the switches SCADA enabled, I do it remotely. If not, then I have my people in the field that go out there, and they are now opening and closing switches to isolate that fault. Once I have it isolated and I have located that fault between which switch or between which protective device it is there, then I'm restoring that power to those customers surrounding by bringing in power from a neighboring feeder or using tie points to neighboring feeders. That's the typical restoration point. Once it's isolated, then in parallel, the resources dispatched out to patrol that line, just like what Ryan was saying, to really literally identify what is the cause of that outage. But there's really a multi-phase approach to that. The first phase is we do emergency switching. Let's just limit the exposure of the outage, isolate the fault, restore power as much as we can. In parallel, resources are underway out there, looking and patrolling the line, finding that fault, hopefully, and then if there's first responders, or we call them trouble resources, that go out there. It's a single-person truck with a bucket in there. They're trying to, 80% of the time, they don't even restore that outage at that time. They're cutting out this little limb, or they put a fuse back in, whatever it is. Or, in 20% of the time, we actually need to call out larger crews, bigger equipment. So the small first responder, the limited resource of the first responders wouldn't be able to solve that outage. There's a larger repair order necessary, and then would be a second wave of resources going out there so the first one would write down a work order, what all has to happen for the repair, and then the crews, a tree trimming crew, or some specialized equipment or some larger manpower has to go out there with bigger equipment to do that repair. And then lastly, obviously, the lights is back on. Again, the metering system is very helpful in this process by telling us where those outages occur, by responding back. But once the meter is out and they have sent their message, they're dead until the power comes back on. They don't help us in the middle of the outage.
They don't have a battery of that.
No. So, good. I mean, I hope that is a little bit helpful. So you see those different phases and steps. We're switching, we're troubleshooting, we're repairing. That's kind of the process we go. And for the most part, it's still fairly dark between the substation, SCADA breaker, and maybe our meters when they go out. And there's more and more SCADA equipment now, so it's getting better, but it's still, remember, the 11% on the 80,000 switches, still a long way to go. We're not anywhere near what transmission visibility we have. And the next slide.
So we're, just for time check, we're at half of our time. I want to make sure we get to the other presenters. So maybe concluding thoughts, we can flip through the last couple and, yeah, do the high points.
We can stop on this next slide
Okay.
and then defer to others and come back later for
Yeah.
questions. But I have been asked a couple times about how stadium safety might inform our thinking about ADER. I don't know yet, but I did just go ahead and drop these in here to define what they were. So part of the knowledge base for the task force and to give you a feel for Encore. So our last service quality report, reported a 2021 SAIDI number of about 68 minutes. And then the safety value for Encore, which is the average number of service interruptions, it's less than 1 per year per customer. It's about 0.82 outages per customer. We'll leave this with you for information. We may be able to come back to it at a later time to talk about how it affects ADER availability.
I was the one who asked that, so, my question is, do you have that feeder level data calculation?
It's in the annual service quality report, which is publicly filed with the PUC every February.
So if an ADR provider aggregator wants to use it, we can use that data to see if.
So right now, you will not be able to match the customer to the feeder number in the service quality reports. Only the utility has that information.
Okay.
So I don't think you'll have the information, in those reports to determine what feeder they are on without our help. So we'll talk.
We will have an idea of which feeder is most relevant for which area to go send off customer for?
I don't think that you're basically, it's gonna be a station name and a feeder number in the service quality reports. I don't believe you'll have enough information to locate where that actually is geographically on our system without our help.
Okay.
We are discussing internally whether that's something we can help with or not, but that's kind of a legal question right now.
So if, as an ADR aggregator, if we give you the customers that we want to connect, you can calculate that, aggregated value for us to see what is the reliability of that area, availability of that area.
We will know which feeder they are on, and we have an annual SAIDI and safety value for each feeder.
I think that would help. Thank you.
The only point to consider in that is that, at the distribution system, it's very likely there's a reconfiguration that is possible, right? So
Yeah, you can only get an average.
my house has been on 3 different feeders since I lived there.
Last thing here, and we can skip the last slide, because those are just kind of some things to take home and think about. Arushi asked about system emergencies, but I'd go first to major storms. It's important to point out that in a major storm, like a hurricane, an ice storm, a severe weather event, it is not uncommon for Encore and our partner utilities to have hundreds of thousands of customers out for hours and worst case scenario days at a time. So that's gonna be something to think about in terms of availability. Let me finish one more slide. And Arushi asked about system emergencies, so that's another point to think about. If our transmission control room receives a load shed instruction from ERCOT, they will pass that quantity of megawatts to shed onto Hagen and to our e-stop. And the way we, perform the load shed function is we turn off distribution feeders. We turn off customers. So it's a choppy mechanism, as Hagen already talked about. But as you know, in Uri, in a really bad event, that will have significant impacts on availability of ADER customers to provide their ancillary services to ERCOT. I'll stop there, and we can come back to other questions later.
I just want, this is not a question just for Encore, it's for all the DSPs, is that we're talking about ADER. If it's just demand response, I think we know what we need to do. But if there are ADERs that will inject, or certain premises will inject into the distribution grid, I would like to hear the concerns from the DSPs. What are the concerns? Is it protection? Is it something else? I don't know what it is. So pretty much, and it's a question for all the DSPs, not just this one. I don't want to look.
I'll go quick. The first thing is, that will never is a strong word. That will likely almost never affect our safety or safety scores, because one, safety and safety is measured in 24-hour chunks, right? And so, if there's something called a major event, that doesn't impact safety or safety. And the only reason why you'd have an ADR go live is because likely it's a major event. Case in point, when it's from Uri, the HEBs that had the antenna rock generators on, they operated, and this kind of touches on your point, they operated in either wholesale mode or resiliency mode. Wholesale mode was when they were connected to a circuit. When we rolled a blackout, they switched over into resiliency mode. And they operated in two separate fashions, and that was that, and it never impacted safety.
Can you prevent taking a circuit out if you have enough exporting devices? You don't never have to take the circuit out if you've got enough export back to the same.
It would have to be coordinated with this SCADA system.
Okay.
The long answer is it's possible, but no one's built that yet.
The Jira is working on is like the opposite of what Rashmi was saying, like instead of like surgical strike for specific low priority meters, what if the opposite is already happening, that some of those meters are running backwards already because they're doing grid dispatch?
So you would have to balance, similar to how ERCOT balances the transmission grid, the frequency, voltage, and all of those things amongst that. Because you're talking about establishing a microgrid, there's protection aspects that you have to establish there to ensure that you have safety amongst that and that the system responds, tree falling, hard hitting a pole or something like that. You don't have a potential safety to the public instance inside of that. You also have to balance so that the frequency and voltage remain stable and within the band, so you don't have equipment damage amongst all. For any place that you're looking to establish an island or a microgrid, no matter who is in control, those are things that must be addressed for the safety, reliability, and stability of that location. And depending upon the number of customers, and both on the generator side and the load side, there has to be a balancing act in there.
Okay. I think in addition to that, when it comes for the purpose of load shed, we need to remember what the purpose is to save the electric system. So there's a very small time window in which we can operate and shed that load, regardless of what the regulatory requirement is, how many minutes we have to respond to that request, to ERCOT. But the faster we're responding, the more beneficial it is to the system. So nobody is sitting there looking at feeders thinking, should I shed this feeder or what else can I do? That is an automated process.
So you have a priority, like going to the hospital.
We have a list, and basically the software is running through that list, opening breakers, bang, 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 and that's all there is to it. And in an emergency situation, if the software crashes for whatever reason, we are prepared to do that same thing manually. But, if everything works as designed, that software is running through those load blocks, whatever it is, 50 megawatts, 100 megawatts, and rotating that load block. So there may be 20 feeders in each block, there may be 50 feeders in each block, but it's basically switching over to allow those customers to come back on, to get off, and there's nobody watching and thinking about what that is or what's happening. It's just breakers on, off, on, off, on, off.
We will add that standard practice is 15 minutes on, off. During winter storm year, due to the size of the load shed, it overwhelmed the system, and what you saw was just large chunks, like hours.
Instead of 15 minutes.
I just don't want you all to think that there is an operator wondering about what that does to certain customers. So that's not the situation to think like that.
I just want to clarify, my question was not on this emergency stuff. My thing was the distribution system has been defined as a radial serving load down the thing. What are the DSP's concerned when we start getting, we already have it with rooftop PV where they inject into the grid.
Yeah.
But if it is done in a coordinated manner in the wholesale market, what are the issues? And this is a question for everyone.
Yeah, we'll cover that, we'll touch on that during the AEP presentation. I think, you have something on that too.
So I'm not talking about extremes, I'm just talking about day-to-day operations.
Yep. All right, Bandera, you're up.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm John Padalino with Bandera Electric. Who are we and why are we here? So we're a member-owned co-op. Compared to Encore, if Encore is a aircraft carrier, we're a little speedboat, maybe even a Zodiac. Where they have 900 substations, we have 15 substations. Where they have 120,000 miles of line, we have about 5,500 miles of line. But we cover an area the size of Delaware, 7 counties northwest of San Antonio, wholly cover Bandera County, and then kind of the 6 touch parts of the 6 surrounding counties. In 2014, we surveyed our members and asked them what they want. We're member-owned. Asked them what did they want, and they said they want access to high-speed broadband and renewable energy. And so we kind of encompassed that desire into what we call our Smart Grid Initiative, where we started deploying more and more fiber optics. So we now have almost 3,000 miles of fiber optic network across our grid, goes past about 83% of our meters. We started an energy service division where we are a solar and storage installer. We are a certified Powerwall installer, and we install other storage capabilities as well. And then we built a platform so that we could engage with our members and explain how they use the power that they're generating behind the meter. A lot of our members didn't understand that the premise consumes, a lot of that, if not all of it, and then what's left over is exported and injected onto the grid, and that's what we would ultimately pay them. We pay avoided wholesale power cost, so it's lower than what maybe they hear from other installers when they talk about net metering, and so there was confusion, and so we built a platform called ApolloWare so that we could educate and inform our members about really how they use electricity, how they consume it, and how they prosume it. And so this is a schematic of our ApolloWare system at the hardware level. Kind of on the far right, you see the load meter, and that's the electric meter that we just had an hour-long discussion about. Going downstream from there is the main service panel. Just about every home in America has one of those, and if they don't, you should call your electrician and ask why. And that's where we install the ApolloWare meter. It's a separate meter behind the meter, where we collect data at the main service panel, and that's where we can get the main load, so we can understand consumption, and if there's anything injected back through the meter, we can catch it there at the main load. And then we might connect wherever the solar and storage, and you can also imagine a battery where we show a solar panel. And we also connect other sub-circuits, and this kind of gets to some of those questions. We're not there yet, but we do monitor sub-circuit load, like all the big stuff. So HVAC, water heaters, pool pumps. In Texas, pool pumps are a huge load that we don't talk about always. The meter we use is revenue grade. We consider it the source of truth, and that's, gets back to the conversations we have with our members about what they should net out on their bill as far as the credit. And it's high fidelity. We collect it every minute, but it's measured every second. And so, it's very high fidelity data that we collect.
John, that's the ACM meter or the revenue grade?
Yes. Yeah. The ApolloWare control module.
The EMS meters cannot go below 15 minutes?
Right, they collect it every 15 minutes.
It cannot be set to collect less than that?
Not that I'm aware of.
It can collect, the analog data points can be collected at a lower granularity than 15 minutes. That's why the 15-minute average is there, and it depends on meter capabilities and things on what kind of averages they can do.
So if we want it, we could probably get it, the lower kind of thing?
So
I don't.
it's a huge upgrade. So the reason why it's 15-minute intervals is because every night it has to
Download
that information. So you're talking about a sizable kind of information bill, and that's why it's not. Yes, it can go lower. No one's gonna pay for that.
Yeah,
It's not worth it.
The constraint is having the ability of ingesting that much information, right? And so that's really the limitation. It wasn't designed for real-time monitoring like you all discussed. It was more for billing purposes, right, consumption type of thing.
What we say at Bandera Electric is smart meters probably a misnomer.
I said it before you.
We believe that, really where we're heading with ApolloWare is the smart meter. We do think there's a lot of information, there's a lot of learning. Essentially this is energy feedback. It gives you real-time feedback on how you're using or transporting energy. As we see the grid turning into a prosumer type grid, this is a kind of information that prosumers will need to understand, if they want to inject and export more, they need to reduce their load more. And to have that full granular kind of information is very important.
So how does this, with Powerwalls installed, how does that ACM meter provide are you getting anything from anything else from the system other than what your ACM meter is getting?
So if you see that dotted line that says current transducer,
Yeah.
we hook they're basically donuts that hook up right on the circuit,
Okay,
right at the
gotcha.
breaker level.
Understood, okay.
And so we're gathering all the information by
So
monitoring.
you could get the full pump
Yep.
separately. Okay.
Yeah, if you look at every little rectangle that's on the main service panel, the big load usually has a dedicated circuit breaker for that, right? So like if it's a 50 amp, I think my HVAC's 100 amp, 50 amp full pump, whatever. Once we identify what that circuit is, then we can put it into the system. And so that's how we do the pool pumps, the HVACs. We identify that because we not only use this for DER monitoring, but we use this as energy feedback as part of our energy efficiency program.
Okay.
And for a utility, it gives us real-time information. And when we talk about DER, it's really important to have the screenshot that you can see there. The yellow line is the energy that's being delivered off the grid. And so the blue line, the distributed generation, it's kind of an aqua blue, and then there's a light green blue below it. That's where the DG starts exceeding what's coming from the grid. And so that's where it's being injected onto the grid. And the red line is where a premise is using, and this is at the aggregated level. So this is all the premises that we have connected to ApolloWare that they first use. The red line is what they first use behind the meter. And then once they go over the red line, that's what's being exported up onto the grid. And you can see, it's kind of from about 11 a.m. noon to about 3 or 4 p.m. on this day. We track weather information, and that way, again, it helps us engage with our customers, our members. If they have a question about their solar production, we can look at what the weather was at that time. And, a lot of times, it was cloudy when maybe you had a little bit lower production. We connect into the ERCOT API. This is more for information purposes, so we know what the price is at ERCOT. And we kind of sum it up on that bottom graph about really what we are purchasing. Our wholesale power provider is LCRA. So we kind of know what we're purchasing from LCRA and what our members are putting up on the grid. And it's said at the bottom of that slide, we've required ApolloWare to be installed on all our DER members since 2020. Our board passed the tariff right at the end of 2019, so effective January 1, 2020, all DER have to have ApolloWare installed. And we use it for reliability. I've been talking a lot about member engagement, but also for reliability, which I'll get into more. This is just another view of what you just saw, but now it's at the substation level. So if you kind of look at the top right, it says substation. It's our Tarpley substation. And so you can start seeing the data starts getting a little more choppy as we start going into the grid. We were at the utility level where it's a little more smooth, and now it starts getting a little more choppy. And this is what it looks like across our service area. You can see where the density of our members are. And so we have DG and battery service locations. We have generation-only service locations. We have a few battery-only service locations. And then the non-DG are people who have it installed for energy efficiency purposes. On the left-hand side, it shows you what we call the connectivity model. So the utilities up top where it says Bandera Electric Co-op, and then as you scroll down, it's all the different substations. So we can click on each of those substations and get substation level data. And the next slide shows you where we can go from a substation. So this is at our welfare substation. Then we can go to the transformer. So this is transformer 2. Then we can go to the feeder. It's the feeder 12-1. And then we can go to what phase that this facility is connected on, and this is on phase A. And so we can aggregate the data all these different ways. However, we want to select the data kind of going down the connectivity model all the way to the service location.
And this is all ApolloWare?
Yes, sir.
And do you build applications off of this, like load balancing, phase balancing kind of stuff?
Not yet, no, sir. We are working with our different SCADA providers to connect the data kind of each way.
Okay.
But we do, that is kind of part of our thought process. So another look at the connectivity model is just from our dashboard, and this is a nice screenshot to see because you can see the fleet that we're monitoring. There's the air conditioners, furnaces, pool pumps. We're rural, so a lot of our members have their own water wells. We can actually spot water leaks through the well pump data. That was particularly useful after Uri. And we have an EV rate that our board just passed in June of this year, or became effective in June of this year. So that helps us try to monitor members who now are, are buying EVs and having EV chargers installed.
So if someone buys an EV charger, they have to install a PoloWare?
They don't have to, but by offering them the EV rate, if they want to take advantage of the EV rate, similar to the time-based use rate, then we install a PoloWare. And a PoloWare is connected with our billing system, so we can true up the bill.
And all of this sits on the AWS cloud?
Yes, sir.
Wow, that's impressive.
That's awesome.
Yeah. This is a service location, just kind of a snapshot. It looks a lot like what we saw with the utility view. Overnight, as we go left to right on the graph, we're at midnight where it starts. The yellow is power coming down from the grid. And then right about 8, the sun was shining this day, so we have a lot of good generation. And really, this premise took no electricity off the grid at about 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning, and actually started exporting right around 9, 10 a.m. And exported all the way until about 6 p.m. So this was we pulled this data like 2 weeks ago, so it was a nice hot day in Bandera, or I think this was out near Tarpley. And then the bottom is just the same information, just kind of shown a different way at the substation level. And here's where I think, where we're getting into the data that maybe the smart meters don't always collect, or AMI meters, I won't call them smart, because here we collect a lot of power quality data from all the different circuits, but this is showing at a premise level. And again, we can aggregate it up the grid so we can see if there's impact from HVACs being turned on, and I'll show some URI data in a little bit. But again, you kind of see this is frequency, so we're kind of right there in the 60 megahertz. And every so often it fluctuates, and we look at it as the different phases. And then we also look at amperage and voltage. And this is that same location that you saw exporting right around 8 a.m. So you can see the power quality start to change once the generation went positive and started injecting into the grid. We measure reactive and apparent power. And again, you kind of see the same change in the data overnight when that premise was pulling off the grid. That's what reactive and apparent power looked like. And then it changed once it started exporting.
So when is all this data available at your...
every minute.
Every minute?
Yes, sir.
Wow, okay. So you could build applications, real-time applications that can take some actions if you design something that there's a detection of.
Yes, sir. Okay. Yep. And then this is probably the most important power quality metric that engineers think about power quality, or the power factor. And again, you kind of see it's a very tight range when the power is coming off the grid, and it starts to get really spiky once the generation starts being injected onto the grid. And that's, it could be the quality of the inverter. I think that's a lot to do with it, but I won't opine on why it's doing that. We just measure it, and it helps us if we start having issues on a certain feeder. We can look at the data. Like the previous presentation said, it is kind of information overload, but by setting alerts and things like that, if we get a call that they're having blinks or something like that somewhere on the line, then we know we can go dig in and see if, anything's causing it out there. And we also install a PoloWare midline and end of line. So that way we can get this kind of data in real time at different points in the grid. And I guess I didn't say this, but kind of in comparison to Encore, because we've done our smart grid initiative, we have about 20% of our grid enabled with SCADA smart DA devices where we can control them from the control room. And the difference with AMI, the top left chart shows that 15-minute interval data. And then kind of over on the right is our ApolloWare data. So with that real high fidelity data, it's a lot smoother and it gives you a better, more realistic look at the data. And this is taken on a 4CP day from 2019. So you can see when that 4CP event happened and where exactly the load was at that time. And then here's, I'm gonna dig into some of what we saw during Uri. So before Uri, if you look to the far left, like kind of the first cold weather day, I think was February 9th, and you can see export happening above what was coming from the grid. And then once it's midnight at February 9th going into February 10th, our entire fleet didn't export again. It's just pulling off the grid on the 10th, the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, 14th. We all know what happened about midnight on the 14th. And now you can start seeing us doing the load shed. That's where the grid wholesale starts coming down right there on the kind of between the 14th and 15th. Again, DER is not injecting into the grid at all. I think the 16th, 17th were sunny days, so a little bit was almost there, but it wasn't enough until it started exceeding coming off the grid on right around the 20th. And that's just good to put into perspective because we were at, the conversation was about, well, how can DER help during an emergency event, extreme weather? We're a winter peaking utility, and this is really good data to show. Up until the 12th, it was just kind of a typical cold Texas winter, a little bit of ice on the 12th, but when it really set in on the 14th, you can just see from the data what was happening when you compare DER, what's putting up on the grid, and the yellow, the wholesale, what's coming down from the grid. The entire utility's living off the grid. And this is what
was the DER actually producing during that load shed event?
It was a little bit,
not injecting into the grid, but at least serving the native load.
A little bit, yeah. We did have some members that were able to stay with power the whole time.
Remember that solar needs to be shut off when it's just solar, so your backfeeding system in an outage. When you stick a battery on there, the entire house island, you immediately detect loss of power flow, and your site controller, your gateway, backup switch, whatever is there, is the power quality disconnect switch. Right there at your meter panel will detect that loss and microgrid your house.
And we have a board member who has 2 power walls, and that's what they.
And that's how it's set up. That if the
You've had a couple of exciting board members.
Yeah. I think 5 of our board members have DER.
That means they have a battery in there, right?
Yeah, at their house. The board member I'm talking about has 2 power walls, so it's about a 15 kW.
So that's why we, in Texas anyway, don't sell solar by itself anymore in residential customers. We sell it with a battery. The value proposition is.
Because if it's grid-tied solar, it gets disconnected.
There's actually a consumer expectation if you get solar. That's how your home will stay.
That's what they think.
Powered.
Yeah.
And it's a huge kind of displeasure for solar owners.
I'm sure a lot of us in the room got those calls during Uri. Well, I have solar. Why am I being cut off? And it's like, do you have a battery? And that was the question. And no, we don't have a battery. Well, you need both to really kind of create that microgrid situation. But the battery fleet, what we saw, what we heard the other day is like the use case is for a lot of emergency backup. And so if you look at like the 9th, the 10th, the 11th, batteries were charging more than they were discharging, especially like on the 11th. I think we started getting a lot of cold weather, outages on the 11th and 12th, and the batteries were really pulling down from the grid on the 13th, even the 14th. So you can think about what was happening on the 14th, and our battery fleet was charging up. And so, folks at ERCOT that were watching the grid we're seeing a lot of load on the grid, of course, from the heaters, the HVAC, but our fleet of batteries were charging as well. So that was impacting the grid at our micro level out at Bandera Electric, and I imagine that you could scale this across the entire ERCOT grid. Then once you go into the load shed event, the 15th, 16th, we're still charging more than we're discharging until about the 18th, and that's where we started engaging with our members and asked them to take it off, you know, that kind of power emergency backup setting, and to see if they could help us by discharging onto the grid, and that's where they started to really help reduce, and this was all about reducing costs, because we knew the prices at ERCOT, and we said if we can get any power from anywhere, we'll take it, and that's about the 18th and 19th, our battery fleet started helping us. And then it kind of went back to normal, just like everything on the 20th. This is a slide, doesn't really have much to do with DER, except it has a lot to do with DER because, and it goes to member and customer experience that, you know, as we roll out this program, customers may expect to get paid a certain amount, and they may not realize that their home is very inefficient. And if their home is inefficient, they're going to use a lot more of their solar or battery powered generation before it ever gets injected onto the grid. And so we measured cold sensitivity. The homes on the left are way more efficient than the homes on the right. And so, you know, that's important to think about and to communicate and to have part of the conversation. Because really the best next use of an electron is to really make a home more efficient. And this slide kind of sums that up in a nutshell. Another way of looking at energy use before Uri and during Uri. Before Uri, here's February 8th. Again, I think that first cold front came through on the 9th. This is what like a typical pleasant winter day in our service area looked like. HVACs were, main load was actually, you know, was dipping down during the day while people were at work. Batteries were charging and discharging just kind of right, not too significantly. Furnaces were running in the morning, but that was about it. And then if you look at the chart on the right, the furnaces and HVACs were almost the entire load. You know, Texans don't like to be cold, and that kind of bears it out right there. That was the load. Interestingly, the pool pumps were cycling, and you know, a lot of pool pumps will just turn on once they hit a certain temperature setting, and so that was a significant part of the load in our territory on our fleet, and I imagine that's the same across the ERCOT grid, and that's also going to affect how a DER fleet can either benefit or not the grid.
What kind of rates did these guys see? Do they have time of use rates or real-time rates?
Most of them are just on our basic retail residential
so it's the same price
same
all day
price,
long?
all day long. We paid upstream significantly
Sure.
for it, but yes.
Yeah, I was hoping you would say something like, no, they were seeing what the real-time rates were.
Yeah, we've been, you know, I mean, as much as we'd like to think that like the entire DER fleet would move to time-based usage rates, they haven't. It's probably, I'm gonna get the number wrong, but like 10 to 20%. So just key takeaways, DER data in the context of utility operations, it's critical for grid reliability, power quality, safety, and customer experience. You know, it's all how we engage with our members. And remember, as a co-op, we're member-owned, we're regulated by our board of directors, all due respect to the Public Utility Commission. We are the billing entity, so we, at the co-op level, we're fully engaged with our customers. And having this kind of data really helps us have a positive conversation with them. And that, you know, the flip side, customer understanding of their performance is critical. What we've seen by monitoring the data is that 20% of DER installations, they have performance issues from day one, where we see inverters clipping and different problems with the inverters. We've helped our members get RMAs from their inverter manufacturers because of the data. And, you know, they may not realize it without this kind of data, and we're able to engage with them on that conversation. And if they don't realize it and they take part in the DER program, they may not see what they think as far as a payback. Third point, extreme weather impacts when batteries are charging, just because of that primary case where they're going to be backing up. If you own a battery, you want it to save your bacon in the case of an outage. So you're going to charge it when maybe ERCOT's asking everybody to conserve energy. When we had conservation alerts going, batteries were charging. This is just important to know that solar installations, they're not necessarily overbuilt because members or customers, I always say members, because our customers are our members, but customers, it's not necessarily that they want to make money off the grid. It's because they're using, when the installer goes out, they use billing data to determine usage. And the billing data isn't very accurate as far as right-sizing the facility. The way we run our energy efficiency program at Bandera is the first thing we do is an audit and put a follower on your house, and we get the data. Then from the audit and the data, we say you need to improve your HVAC. And once you do the energy efficiency improvement, then we'll sell you solar and storage. But we don't think you should have solar and storage until your energy envelope is efficient, and that's the kind of final 2 points there is most homes in Texas are inefficient. The best thing we could do is make them efficient.
Question, so you showed a profile on a normal day where the solar output was injecting into the grid.
Yes, sir.
What concerns does distribution, like Bandera Co-op have when you have this kind of injection into the grid?
Power quality, voltage, if its voltage is ticking up and we want to watch it going up to the level, not all the capacitors can take that depending on what their settings are. And so we want to monitor that, and that's why we require it for grid reliability.
Protect.
It require what?
Another, sorry, go ahead.
You say you require?
We require a follower.
Okay, so that's that acquisition, okay.
Yes.
And protection, I guess.
Yeah, protection, phase balancing, there's a lot to this, and I think it's important to understand, we're talking specifically DDRs right here. All the other customers that aren't DDR customers, that's who the utilities really need to look out for and make sure that the quality is across.
So specifically with load balancing, you would have the same effect if someone reduced their load, wouldn't you? Rather than an injection. To me, load balancing is pretty much the same.
Phasing is very important. I think you're better suited for this, but you could tend to get a lot of EV charging or a lot of generation on a single phase, which then.
But they have the same effect, right?
Well,
you have to.
So if you think of load reduction, that can lower to zero. A generator can go negative, which means reverse power flow on potentially a single phase, which has another effect of the voltage profile of the feeder, the balance of voltage seen by your three-phase customers.
So your existing load balance stuff will not.
Yeah, load balancing of load only is something that utilities have mitigated for the entire history of multi-phase systems. However, the generation, and especially the single-phase generation, presents new challenges to that.
That's a perfect segue to the one that's coming up.
And one comment I want to make is that the ApolloWare installation is not currently something that is allowed by Texas state law of the TDUs. So Encore cannot install anything beyond the meter. The meter is the endpoint to which Encore has capability of installing. Municipalities and co-ops the NOEs have different capabilities than the TDUs.
I have a quick question.
Hey, can I ask y'all a question? This is Jimmy Glotfelty.
Sure, go ahead.
Do y'all have any 4-quadrant inverters on your system?
I'm not sure.
So every power wall is a 4-quadrant system.
So yeah.
What 4-quadrant means real reactive power leading and lagging. That's all it means. It means that whatever the battery is doing power, it is able to manage the volt ampere capacity.
Right. Correct.
And keep it down.
And all new inverters certified the UL 1741 SB are 4-quadrant.
Everything that's 1741 certified is 4-quadrant.
So is that all inverters or is that all Powerwall inverters?
So UL 1741 SB applies to all inverters that are certified. It is a United States standard.
Thank you.
And so that does not mean all historically for
Sure.
previous certifications of 1741 have those capabilities. We said there's UL 1741, which was 2002, I believe, and then UL 1741 SA, which was about 2014, and now we have UL 1741 SB, which is end of last year.
Okay, thank you.
If we put 714 in any kind of base requirement, I don't see any company commissioner, that would be unable to meet that.
All right, one more question and we'll go to AEP.
So mine was almost the same, so most of these inverters have these standards and they can have settings that can comply with or like voltage set points and frequency set points or whatever to help with management, right?
There are bands established to which the inverter capability is mandated by 1547/2018. So as long as those settings are within those bands, then yes.
Okay, so it is mostly just ensuring that the people who are installing it comply with what was hitting the DSP and then it is.
All right, so those that haven't been following along on Teams, Scott Henson from the Street has posted into our Teams folder some additional information related to the discussions that we've been having with Bandera. So thanks, Scott, for doing that. AEP, on to you.
Thank you, sir. Alex Ramirez with AEP. With me is Chris Johnson, Managing Director of Innovation and Technology, and Chris Schaefer, our Director of Distribution Real-Time Operations. So we're going to touch on the capabilities, right, that hopefully have already been illustrated with the two presentations we just had. On one end, we have the real estate. I've got one here. Yeah. On one end, we have the current state ability of the TDSP to monitor the distribution system. And on the other end, we got a taste of better monitoring abilities to pick up specific data points that help us effectively manage the grid, the distribution system. And so we agree, I think we all agree that it's imperative to make sure that we have a healthy distribution system, to make sure that we maximize the value of DERs, aggregated or not. The other thing is that we'll have a customer base that is diverse. And so on one end, we may have customers that are adopting DERs, and in other cases, we're not going to have it. And so our responsibility is to make sure that we're delivering electricity to all the customers we serve, whether or not they're participating in this pilot. The other thing is that as it relates to DERs, right outside of the VPP concept, we also have large DERs such as battery projects that are coming in tying to distribution system up to 10 megawatts that also create, right, a series of potential issues on the distribution system that we'll have to monitor. And so the capability building is what we'll focus on today. AEP Texas serves a bit over 1 million customers. We cover over 95,000 square miles. Our footprint is on the screen, and so it's everything that's in orange all the way from the Gulf Coast to West Texas, west of Alpine, from the towns that are in the southern portion of the state, up against the border with Mexico, all the way up to the Vernon area, north of Texas. I'd like to also make reference to the fact that AEP Texas is part of a bigger family, and so AEP as a whole serves more than 5 million customers, and we operate in 11 states. AEP Texas happens to be one of those operating companies. There's also experience in working with RTOs, and so obviously Texas works very closely with ERCOT. We also have experience with PJM and SPP. A few things that I'd like to just make reference to that came up in previous presentation. One is I want to highlight the fact that the system is designed for a one-way power flow. And Oncor did an outstanding job illustrating, right, the way the system is, the architecture, right, the way it's designed. And so that also includes the system protection. And so I want to make sure that I bring emphasis to that, because the system protection is there considering the fact that it's one-way power flow. What we're up against now is a multi-source power flow, right? And we're not just talking about the residential DERs that have the ability of exporting, but we have, load management stuff that may be happening. We have large resources that are also interfacing with the distribution system. And so we just have to be mindful of the fact that our job is to make sure that we keep that safe and reliable delivery, right, of electric service. What I'd like to do is turn it over to Chris Schaefer so he can walk us through some of these slides. I know we have a few minutes. Hopefully we'll be able to hit on the highlights there. Chris?
Perfect. Yeah, thanks, Alex. So good morning, everybody. I think maybe where we'll start here is, what we're really trying to do is tie together what was talked about this morning in terms of how do we achieve these capabilities at scale, and how can the pilot really assist us in doing that. We recognize there's a huge shift in what needs to happen to get, utilities like AEP to a Bandera situation that has, full visibility of that system. It's going to take a lot to get there. First, maybe we'll kind of talk about the fundamentals here, a couple fundamentals that we're dealing with. So when you have there's a couple key fundamentals that an energy delivery company needs to follow. One is around reliability and safety associated with the system, as well as striking a balance of generation and load in real time. So as generation occurs, that needs to be consumed on the load side, with the exception of energy storage, obviously. How that model currently works today is that you have large central generation, flows through transmission. Transmission is really that engine that moves that energy across large distances to get it where the load will consume it. And then, as we've talked a lot about here today, the distribution system really brings that home to the end customer in a radial fashion, a one-way fashion. What we're really seeing here with DERs is that, thinking long-term, you're going to have, and we're seeing this with coal and fossil fleet, start to shrink on the central generation side and increase on the distributed generation side. So now all of the SCADA, visibility, redundancy, everything that was put into the transmission system to make sure that it can get that energy where it needs to be consumed, that's going to now, the distribution system is going to be part of that. And as we learned today, it's just not there. We don't have the SCADA visibility. We, in many cases, rely on customer calls or delayed information to make predictions about where these outages are.
Listening in on something, but I can walk out.
Oh, okay. So anyhow, we have a fundamental shift here in what we're trying to achieve, and so it's obviously going to take a long time to get the distribution system up to a standard and have the capabilities to be able to move that energy, much like the transmission system does, with us having the visibility across both of those platforms. You also, as you start to grow that distributed side, you start to introduce flows across from distribution into transmission. And so now there's a heavy coordination that'll need to happen between those. So I think we can probably move to the next slide. Trying to move through this fairly quickly. So there's a few key things that we recognize that need to occur for us to be able to make this shift to where there's more reliance on the distribution system going forward. One of those is putting in an advanced distribution management system. This is really the EMS, if you will, of the transmission system, the core brains of how we're going to operate the system going forward. But that, these ADMS systems can't do their job unless you get the data right. And the data is absolutely critical. And what you got to realize is we have systems, distribution systems, that have 75-year-old equipment, 100-year-old equipment out there. In many cases, we don't know what's on the pole. We don't know how it's supposed to operate. We really are lacking that visibility. And so there's a lot of work that needs to go into really building out an accurate view of those distribution networks, and really building out that power flow model to where we understand whether it's through SCADA, whether it's through operational forecasting, whether it's through whatever inputs, this ADMS system will help us make sense of what's really happening in real time and allow us to start moving energy, as I described earlier. A couple other things that are definitely on our mind are around the hardening of our environments, making sure that all of this data, we're talking about a lot of data, a lot of communications, all of that's protected in a way that protects our customers, protects our systems from potential intrusion by, bad actors. The last bullet I have there is kind of around the data exchanges. I think that's something that, generation and transmission have this figured out. They have, at least within the AEP environment, have a good exchange of data across those operational systems. We really need to get to a point where we can start to exchange between the distribution and the transmission system. So next slide there. Another capability that we're working towards in terms of the tools that will allow us to achieve this is around DERMS, and I think we've probably all heard about DERMS. But really, this will give us the ability to integrate DERs and the operation of DERs into that power flow network model that I talked about on the ADMS. And so that'll be absolutely critical that we get, and it'll be through a variety of mechanisms, but we get real-time views of what these assets are doing so that it plays in, like we talked about earlier, to the big picture of not only can we manage DER customers and their output, but can we manage a system in a reliable and safe way for all of our customers? And that's kind of the key there. So I think we can move on. So as we kind of move into looking at the pilot, there's AEP has a strategy in place to move forward with tools and data exchanges, all that kind of stuff, but we're still very early on in terms of getting this all set up and running. So we'd like to leverage this pilot in a way that helps us advance those capabilities potentially quicker within AEP and potentially other utilities here that allows us to get to a state to where we can manage this a lot better than we can today. So focusing on kind of building that system view, the coordination of data flows between RTO, aggregators, operators, all of that's going to be very important. I think this pilot can help flesh out what are some of those needs there. The DER override, and not necessarily override, but how do we influence, how do we strike that balance so that DER customers play an important role and it's not a negative thing, it's a positive thing. We use it for the capabilities, but also how to, balancing between the operation of all of the customers on the system. And then I think we can probably just maybe skip this one. This was some readiness considerations in terms of like what types of things would help us feel more comfortable with what we're trying to achieve here. A lot of it's around making sure the data's right, making sure that we have real-time visibility into these assets. The proper studies are going to be critical to make sure that we feel comfortable up front that it's not going to produce an issue on the system. So we can leave that as maybe something for folks to take away. So with that, I've covered a lot in probably 10 minutes. Any questions?
On the hosting capacity section over there, the last bullet, sub-bullet under that, power flow considerations, backfeed to transmission. What's the major concern over there? Because right now, a lot of people have put rooftop PV on their thing, and we have seen at the RTO level that some of our loads that when we model our transmission grid, we do see injections coming in from modeled loads on the transmission grid. So what is the concern over there? That's the part I'm just trying to get a grasp of, because if it's demand response, it's a load reduction. But if it's PV, I'm trying to differentiate between a PV injecting into the grid uncontrolled versus an ADER injecting into the grid controlled? What is the difference in terms of DSP operations? Is there any difference at all?
Yeah, and I may need some help from the transmission side.
No, I'm not talking about transmission. Let's just focus on the
Well, we're
distribution
talking
side.
about injection into the transmission system.
No, that is a secondary thing, but I'm saying,
Okay,
if I have a distribution system that DSPs are managing, they get uncontrolled injection into the DSP grid from rooftop PVs today. Right?
correct.
How is that, what is the impact of that, and how is it any different from if you have an ADER injecting into the grid?
So the impact on an individual, premise, right, and it ties back to the interconnection process.
Right, absolutely.
We study the impact of the individual DER, right, that's getting installed. And so we mitigate or address any potential issues that export ability may have.
Okay.
And it starts with the service cable that goes from your distribution transformer to your weatherhead, right? Now, so that's an individual function, right? What we're talking about here with the aggregated is you have a synchronized way, right, of having many more DERs, right, work simultaneously. And so now we're talking of potential impacts beyond, right, the service cable. Now we're looking at, potential power quality issues, right, on primary voltage. And so having the monitoring ability, right, in the distribution line is important. There's a difference between a single DER functioning and having the aggregated, right?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm looking at it from the interconnection process. Let's just focus on that. So you have a feeder that's feeding a subdivision. So maybe in year one or two guys put the PV on it. You kind of, I'm assuming you kind of test individual ones and then see its impact on that feeder feeding that subdivision. And then as more and more come along, I'm assuming, because these are all rooftop PVs and they might all inject at 3 o'clock in the afternoon into the grid. And you'll have to see that, hey, is that feeder going to get overloaded in an opposite direction and have to do something about that. I'm assuming that your interconnection studies is not just focused in isolation individually, but you also see its impacts on the feeder.
The other issue is that in the ADER concept, you're aggregating resources that may not be on the same feeder, and they are controlled in whole by another party, which then have impacts that we don't understand.
And potentially unpredictable in terms of storage. Storage can be manipulated to do whatever, whenever. Solar, at least, you have some sort of operational profile there. So with storage, you could get into situations where an aggregation of resources are following some signal, right? Meanwhile, we have conditions on the distribution system that may require reconfiguration. It may require some sort of manipulation to the physical grid itself and the way that energy flows. Now, as you have that aggregation, it becomes maybe part of a different part of the distribution system because a switch was thrown over. So now you have power flows that are much different than maybe what you were expecting, worst case, from that single
So I see
energy
an
source.
issue over there is that if it's an aggregation, you will have churn. People move in, people move out. So do you have any thoughts on how you're going to manage the studies of that?
Well, I think, your broader question is how is it going to be different? Nominally, it won't be different.
Okay.
Nominally, in a perfect world, at the distribution level, the impacts will be similar to what they are in solar. However, theoretically, we don't know what it's going to look like to have.
So it's an unknown right now.
Yeah.
Right, and to add to that, the operation, when you see solar come on, it's not flipping a switch. And that's kind of, if you want to know what keeps us up at night, it's the fact that we're getting instantaneous load where solar ramps up and allows the system to, there's actually, no kidding, some organic adjustment. The transformers warm up, things like that happen, that we're not going to have an opportunity to really study until this pilot goes. Now, when it comes to moving in and out, how we're going to manage that, I think it's going to be managed, by necessity.
we're not
Or,
gonna.
or move in, move out, the equipment's not gonna change, it's gonna stay there, just a different person.
But I think
The
the exciting part, excuse me, sorry for interrupting, the exciting part about this pilot is the fact that it gives us the opportunity
Okay, good, yeah.
to test some assumptions, to deploy some, better, ways of measuring and monitoring that we currently don't have today. And the issue about, SAIDI and safety came up in our conversation earlier. Naturally, as you develop a better ability to monitor what's happening on your distribution system, naturally, that gives you information that you're able to leverage, right, to address other type of issues that affect your SAIDI and safety, right? For example, not spending 30, 45 minutes to an hour finding what caused the outage, right? And so that's just the value, right, that we can bring to the table for a bigger purpose, right?
In general, I agree with, that maybe it's helpful for those that, we all are kind of trying to think along, what are the implications and how it affects, to a large degree, it's still somewhat theoretical because we don't have the penetration levels to really be concerned about it at the current, market status that we have. But in general, it's a function of magnitude, geographic concentration, and the time synchronization. Those are the three factors that we're eyeing at how they affect our operations and the protection on the distribution level. And the pilot gives us the opportunity to learn more about the effects than that there is an immediate concern that things gonna fall apart. That's not the case.
Yeah, but the distribution system is really done in an upfront way. So when we have planning, distribution system planning, and they figure out how this thing's gonna work steady state, and then maybe, what are some maybe abnormal conditions that we could go through. But a lot of planning goes up front to make sure that it's robust enough to handle those solutions. Right now, what we're talking about is turning that into a dynamic situation where we don't know what to expect. And without the visibility, the real-time visibility of SCADA and all of that type of capabilities, we're almost flying blind. And so that's where we tend to get a little bit of concern here, because it goes against the model that utilities were comfortable with. But I think the pilot is perfect to kind of help us learn about, how we can use DERs to the benefit, or what equipment do we need to be successful going forward.
Or whether, the concerns you have right now based on the unknown is valid, or are there new concerns that might pop up?
Right.
Yeah, remember, the AMI meter is not designed for real-time monitoring. And so here's an excellent opportunity, right, to adopt some of those new capabilities and better understand exactly what it's gonna do.
So is it time to roll out AMI version 2?
All right, yep.
Yeah, so if we have the inverters that satisfy or meet the setting requirements that, you guys have for the DSP level, and if the aggregation is within at feeder level, energy profile that you set in, then that should address most of the concerns, right?
Well, that's probably a conversation we need to have separately, outside of this, forum. I think the issue here is being able to manage, right, the power flow that's happening in the distribution system and account for some of the configurations changes that may be happening outside of the normal state, right? And so, even if we do a study, right, we're doing it under assuming a normal state of the system, but that's dynamic. On the distribution system, that changes often. And so,
Yeah, but as I said, it would be similar to load changing, and so
Yeah.
this is like, if your feeder has this much load and the injection is within that load level, it is just equivalent to reduction of the load, and so that's what I was saying. If it is within a profile that you have for each of the feeders, then it should minimize the impact. And if the voltage and the frequency and other set points are set appropriately to what you want, then that would minimize the other issues that would come up.
But there'll be an upfront consideration for here's operationally how the DER should perform. There's also a real-time component, and that's the piece we all have to figure out.
Rashmi, we have real-time contingency analysis that fills in the gaps that planning didn't take into account, right?
Yes.
I don't know.
So we may ask a DER to tweak settings for the current conditions rather than what was planned up front and approved.
Right.
That's where it gets really kind of messy here.
And the thing is, if it is within a certain level of load change, then you are right now able to manage the ADER changes without having that real-time telemetry. So if it is within the load change, then it could be extrapolated that it is okay without telemetry.
I mean, yeah, at the volumes we have today, there's not a whole lot of concern, right? I think it works pretty well, because it's mainly an offset of load and not an offset of
And I would say that
Yeah.
current dynamics of load and the load balancing, load management is driven by factors such as temperature, and things like that don't change in a 15-minute interval. And so, that while the current practices address similar situations, the timeframes and the mechanisms to which we address them, we can measure in days, not minutes.
One quick question here. So, increasing the power to the grid directly from solar versus from the battery, solar and battery, right? So, do you think the power quality goes better from the battery?
It's a inverter-based generation, so.
I guess one difference I would point out is, I think you used the word predictable. I think the thing I would be most worried about is it's almost predictable that in the tail end of February, when we don't have any heating load, maybe no air conditioning load, those solar PVs are gonna be working great. And that's when you're gonna have like this fear of injections from the solar when there's no load in the system. That's worrisome, and like you said, you can see that coming the day before. Hey, tomorrow at 3 o'clock, we're gonna have all this excess output on the distribution system. Whereas with the ADRs, I think we're talking about, it will be following instructions, and there could be a change, within a 15-minute period. And I think we just need to, part of the pilot is to learn what kind of changes can we expect and what are the assumptions. And if you start with, well, if they get the right, they get the right price signal, and if we give them the right instructions, they should be doing beneficial things on the distribution system. But we have to learn that through the pilot,
And it looks like the ALR, same principle, when we use it, right? It's exactly, I just the difference. Just the exporting to the grid, right? But there is a certain amount of capacity that the grid can handle. And the difference being is ALR is fundamentally reducing. Reducing, So that's going to be the issue, especially at the local level where to be frank, we think is overwhelmed at this location.
All right, I appreciate the engagement, on these topics. I think there's a lot more discussion to be had. But I think even though we went over time, I think it was worth it to advance the knowledge of the entire group. For those of you listening in on Teams, we will be posting the presentations that were given today in Project 53-911, so you can find the material there. Just as a reminder, we do have our fourth and final session for the week, tomorrow morning, where ERCOT will present. We'll just have the one presentation. And again, thank you all for the engagement today and for all that you're doing outside of these workshops. I know there are a lot of meetings going on as we prepare for our work next week. And just keep in mind that the primary focus right now is developing the governing document along with ERCOT. So now's probably the time to start focusing our conversations on that, both in these workshops and in your separate segment meetings, so that we don't want to forget the things that we might put in the parking lot to come back to, but to make sure we have a good use of our day-long meeting next Friday, focusing on that governing document and bringing those critical things forward that we must decide as a task force where we can get consensus around, and if there's anything that we can't. So start kind of thinking about that being the focus for the next week, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.